Welcome in, everybody, to the Flagship Podcast. I am Chip Brown of Horns247.com, joined, as always, by my esteemed colleague, the one and only Eric Henry of Horns247.com. And Eric, we are recording on Wednesday, January 24th. Lot has been happening for the football program. Winter workouts are underway. That's right. The 2024 season begins now. We've got Texas men's and women's basketball on the uptick. We will get into that. But obviously, winter workouts, Eric, still no defensive line coach for the Texas Longhorns, and that may have become complicated by a former Longhorn defensive lineman's attractiveness to his current job. We'll get into that, but Eric, here we go, my man.
Here we go, indeed, Chip. It was a little nice, you know what I mean? I won't lie, to check the social media, interwebs and see photos released from Texas football's Twitter account of Quinn Ewers and other players back there getting winter conditioning it. It's kind of crazy to think, it's only been about 2.5 weeks since that Sugar Bowl loss, but time waits for no man, and certainly this Texas Longhorn program has plenty of time to make up since their last college football national championship. Looking to get back, looking to finish the deal, Chip. So it is never too soon to get back out there. They're young, right? They've had a couple weeks off. The bodies have healed. Quinn Ewers has made the rounds. He's done a little hunting. He's been up there in Tarrant County in front of the county commissioners receiving his awards. It's time to get back into shape, right? Not that they ever, got out of shape, but time waits for no man.
Yeah, time waits for no man. And look, Texas has a lot to replace on both the offense and defense. Defensively, you lose Outland Trophy winner Tavondre Sweat and the team's leading pass rusher, Byron Murphy. You lose two-time first-team All-Big 12 middle linebacker Jalen Ford. You lose your, multi-year starter at safety Jaron Thompson, who entered the portal. And you lose your boundary corner, Ryan Watts. And don't forget, they usually put the punter on the defensive side, Ryan Sanborn, who did a great job, unsung hero of 2023, 45.7 yards per punt. Now Texas will be looking to a true freshman who they believe in, Michael Kern, who is not an early enrollee, by the way. So he will be showing up in June. But then on offense, obviously you lose your top 5 pass catchers and your leading rusher. The pass catchers, Xavier Worthy, Adonai Mitchell, Jatavian Sanders, then Jordan Whittington, and then Jonathan Brooks, who's also your 1,000-yard rusher. So a lot to replace there, Eric. Winter conditioning is when that leadership starts to develop. And obviously on offense, you've got Quinn Ewers. You've got some veteran offensive linemen. What's interesting to me is going to be the leadership on defense. And Jahdae Barron is a guy who comes back as a fifth-year senior who had accepted his invitation to the Senior Bowl, but decided, you know what? There's more to be done. We still don't know if he's going to wear number 7 because Michael Huff handed him that jersey in his announcement video. But what are your thoughts on the leadership on the defensive side?
Chip, it's interesting you mentioned the leadership aspect, right? Because I'm sure you've heard this in the amount of time you've been covering sports. You have some guys who are considered those vocal leaders, right? The Jalen Fords and, the inspirational guys, Jordan Whittingtons. And then you have some guys who, when you ask them, Chip, right, what's your leadership style? And they say, I'm more of a lead by example, right? I let my play do the talking and hope the guys kind of follow me. And I think that's great. You can't have too many of both. You can't have too many guys who, think they're the rah-rah voice guy, because then that message gets watered down, right? We know that leadership committee only had about like 6 to 8 names of like true veterans. And of course, Quinn Ewers were there. And then you can't have too many of those guys who say, okay, I'm not going to be the vocal guy. I'm not going to be the one who's going to hold the young guy accountable verbally. I'm just going to hope that they see what I do and follow behind. So to your point, as far as defensively, I mean, I think it starts with Jahdae Barron, right? Someone who is well respected on that team, well respected on that side of the ball, and certainly someone who backs it up with his play, not only on the field, but his preparation off the field. Film room study, who's going to be that guy, Chip? We remember early in spring ball, in fall camp, when we were talking to the guys, and Jaron Thompson said to us, like, yeah, I'm the guy who'll have the guys over at my apartment, right? And we'll watch film and do that, because sometimes it's nice to do it away from the facility. Like Jahdae, I can see being that guy who naturally slides into that role. But then you look further, I would say Anthony Hill can be a guy who you say his production on the field, his tremendous effort, someone who's putting in the time and effort to become a better player, can be one of those types of leaders. I'm intrigued to see where guys like, Ethan Burke, Baron Sorrell, guys who will be now multi-year starters, do they gradually slide into that role? David Benda, Benda is someone who I think kind of fits a little bit of both, Chip. I mean, when we talk with Benda, he's not the most boisterous guy, certainly, well-spoken, but he's not the most boisterous or loudest voice. But I think he's someone who, just by virtue of having been around the program so long and having earned his place in that Texas program, it can be someone who ascends into that role as well. So those are some of the names I'm keeping my eye on, Chip.
Yeah. And Texas was lucky, or they created their own luck by developing really good players on both lines. Casey Hampton, I always think back to him because Dan Neal told me it's good if your most feared and best leaders are on the lines, your biggest guys, because they're the ones that no one will like get into it with because they're afraid of getting, punched in the face. So, Texas had that last year with Devondre Sweat and Byron Murphy. I mean, Sweat is big and just monstrous as a playmaker as he was. Byron Murphy was the guy that everyone was like kind of afraid of. And if Murphy said, "Hey, we got to pick it up," they all were like, "Okay, we got to pick it up." And so it'll be interesting to see if Alfred Collins or Vernon Broughton. Alfred Collins, third highest rated defensive player on the team last year, behind Sweat and Murphy. Coming back, huge announcement that Alfred Collins is coming back for a 5th year. So he hasn't been that guy, but could he become that guy? And they need leadership in every position group. They had it last year. It was a big deal. It's something that flies under the radar, but they did have position leadership experience across the board. And that makes a huge difference. Gunnar Helm. I mean, if we're going to kind of look at each position group, Gunnar Helm's a guy who he's earned the right to step up and lead. Obviously, you've got Jake Majors, Kelvin Banks on that offensive line. Let's see if DJ Campbell's ready to, Hayden Connor's a guy who will speak his mind. We know that. And then the running backs, Jaden Blue and CJ Baxter, how far along are they in their development as guys who will step up and lead? Because they are clearly the leaders now of the running back room, and I think have earned the right to step up and lead.
Yeah, Chip, it's funny. I want to come back to something you said there as far as, kind of the intimidation factor, right? When you got certain guys at defensive tackles and all offensive linemen. It kind of reminds me, Chip, do you remember the old infamous clip where Peyton Manning and Jeff Saturday are getting into it, right? And, they're getting to about run the football, and then Tarek Glenn, the big 6'8" left tackle comes over. And it's the funniest thing to me, Chip, when, Tarek Glenn says, go sit down. Peyton says, I will sit down, right? Sometimes you need that big guy to kind of come over there and say, hey, enough is enough. So just really quick to your point, I do think, listen, football players are not scared of anyone. They're not, they're all tough guys, but there's something to be said about that big intimidating presence. Maybe Kelvin Banks is someone who, despite being a kind of a baby face, and I mean that affectionately, Kelvin, if you see this, I think he's spoken about, Chip, right? Remember when the O-line was going through some of their struggles early on, he talked about that group not being afraid to have open and honest conversations, where they can kind of just shoot straight with each other, right? So I think that could be another guy there, as you talked about Hayden and Connor and others. Gunnar Helm certainly has earned the right by virtue of his playing time, of his effort. He's one of those guys in my mind who, Gunnar might not be the most, vocal guy, but you go out there and you look and you see someone who's doing everything right. I think Michael Taft, Chip, could be another one of those guys, right? He could be a veteran guy who, how many times have you heard, coaches say if we had X amount of Michael Taft, we'd be in great shape, right? So there are guys who I think who have been around the program a ton. But just, and again, in my belief, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that each position kind of had those guys last year. I think, especially with football teams, because you're dealing with groups of 53, I did an NFL example, excuse me, but you get the point, right? You're dealing with larger numbers of players. It's not like basketball where you can have either one star player or just one veteran voice. I think you have to have a solid mix, an amalgamation of guys who are standouts on the field, who bring that presence, but also guys who, by virtue of being respected, also earn that leadership title as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is going to be, these guys are now the culture carriers, and the culture was fantastic last year, but it is not a guarantee from year to year. It depends on who's carrying the message, who's enforcing the culture. You want it to be a player-led situation, because those are the teams that typically win. Those are the teams that handle adversity better than coach-led teams. And so that is definitely something that we are watching as winter workouts get going. And the freshmen they're in a separate group, and for about 2 weeks while they get acclimated to the program, and then they join the veterans and Torrey Becton, who another unsung hero in this Texas football program in my mind, because he's your culture coach. He's the guy who's working with these guys right now while the rest of the staff is out recruiting, trying to get ready for the February signing date. And Torrey Becton's the one that has to connect with each guy, has to find how to reach each guy. He is a verbal listener as a strength coach, which, look, he's going to tell you how it needs to be, but he's also going to listen to see how you need to be coached, which I think is one of his gifts. We've all seen that strength coach that's just that my way or the highway guy, and toughen up, sissy boy, and that's not who Torrey Becton is. But he is going to do everything he can to get everything out of you. And I think the lack of soft tissue injuries that Texas has had since he's been here speaks for itself. And clearly, I think Torrey Becton, also by virtue of the fact that he was sought after by the NFL last year. I heard he got calls this year, maybe even from Alabama. But I think he's staying at Texas. Eric, the defensive line coach position is the last staff position that Steve Sarkisian needs to fill at the moment. And I don't think there's any question that Rod Wright, who played at Texas and served as the assistant defensive line coach for the Houston Texans this year, is a guy who Steve Sarkisian has talked to. He's talked to several candidates, but I think Rod Wright was one of those candidates. And now it looks like the Houston Texans could be elevating him to defensive line coach from assistant defensive line coach, because they were so impressed with the work he's done. And so we're all watching that situation. And but I do think that Steve Sarkisian is getting close to having this situation, making his hire. And so, that's something that we're watching too, because you've got to have that chemistry, that symmetry. We know Johnny Nansen, coming in as the co-defensive coordinator, linebackers coach, had worked with Pete Kwiatkowski at Montana State. There's comfortability there. We know Johnny Nansen obviously was on Sarkisian's staff at both Washington and USC. But you've got to have, I mean, that defensive line coach is almost as important as the defensive coordinator, because that's the guy who's getting you developed in the trenches.
Yeah, I mean, I just pick it up where you left off there, Chip. I mean, everything starts up front, both sides of the ball, right? None of the whether it's the guys on the outside on offense or guys on the outside in defense, you can't get anything going unless you have that interior filled in. The thing that I feel most confident about, Chip, and listen, you've been on top of it since pretty much the news of Bo Davis leaving for LSU, and you can check out the boards of Horns 24/7 elsewhere to be staying the latest as far as that position coach search. But I think the one thing you feel most confident in is that Steve Sarkisian is going to get someone of quality, and maybe, Chip, that is, my old group of five background showing, right? Because I know once at that level, you miss on your first guy. And listen, it's no disrespect to any of the coaches who've coached at that level, but there's usually a big gap between that first target there and then the guy you end up getting if you whiff on that one, right? It's like, all right, who can we get to come in here who's going to take this job for the money we have to offer? At Texas, and especially with Steve Sarkisian, none of those things are going to be in play. I mean, there's still, Chip, in my mind, there are names out there, I think, should Rod Wright fall through, that you can keep an eye on, names of quality, names who would fit well. But just to kind of hammer home your point, is it about, just getting someone who can fit and can kind of, have recruiting ties to Texas and fill the role? Or is it about getting someone like a Johnny Nansen, right? Someone who you say, okay, we lose X, we know we are getting someone who's at least right there in terms of that level, if not maybe a notch or two above that replacement. So time will tell, but I do feel confident in my mind, just, given what Steve Sarkisian has to offer, what Texas has to offer, they're going to get someone who, it may take some time to earn that respect and that willingness to run through a wall like those guys were for Bo Davis, but they're going to get someone of quality.
Yeah. Someone asked me if Ed Orgeron was interested in the job, and I'm told he is content sitting on his pile of money, and is not interested in grinding as a D-line coach once again. At this point, who knows?
Chip, not to cut you off, but just the last time we've seen Ed Orgeron on social media, does that man look like he's anything less than content with his life right now?
Yeah. I think he was in bed with someone, right? Well, that's neither here nor there. All right. So a couple of football items there. Texas basketball, Eric. The Longhorns, who were 1-3 and looking like it was shoot, ready, aim in terms of the game plan from Rodney Terry. The Longhorns have now won 2 in a row against ranked opponents, at home against Baylor last weekend and last night, Tuesday night in Norman, Oklahoma. Texas pulls away for the 75-60 win. Another big night from Max Asmus. He had 22 points. Dylan Dezue, 19 points, 10 rebounds. And Kendall Weaver, baby. Kendall Weaver, who I've been banging the drum for since that Marquette loss, because he was out there hustling his ass off no matter how far down they were. And I was like, okay, well, this guy gets it. He's, Rodney Terry talks all the time about defense, and get lost in your defense, your offense will come. Well, Kendall Weaver elevates the whole team's defense in my mind. He came in at the 16-10 mark last night, played great defense on, OU's talented guards who didn't tear up Texas last night. I'm interested in your thoughts on this, because I wrote this morning in the Morning Brew there at horns247.com that there's an identity that's starting to form. It's, You've got the inside attack led by Dylan Dizu, you got the outside attack led by Max Asmus, and then you've got the defensive identity, which to me is led by Kendall Weaver, but he's only averaging 14.6 minutes per game, Eric.
Yeah, Chip, I'm going to come to Kendall in a second. I mean, listen, let's just start with the fact that, as you talked about, after that UCF loss, and there's no need to rehash what happened with the horns down and that whole deal, but it was ugly for a minute, And I mean, I asked Rodney Terry, he could care less about what, guys like us say, but when his peers in the industry, the Seth Greenbergs and the Fran Fraschillas and, Jay Billises and those people of the world, are finding, room to critique his reaction to that had to sting a little bit, right? So credit him. He's stayed the course. He's been true to his 24-hour rule, and we're going to go back at in terms of practice the next day. And he's picked up 2 wins that, quite frankly, Chip, when they entered this stretch of what was 6 straight ranked opponents, now TCU is now unranked, so I believe it's 5 to date as we're taping this. But I felt they had to get at least 3 to feel confident that of whatever could come following this stretch of the Big 12 campaign. Well, they've got the first 2. As mentioned, TCU now unranked. The contest with Houston is certainly one that's going to be challenging, but you've got BYU ahead. I don't think there's any reason why this team, given the level of basketball they've played over the past 2 nights, couldn't go to Provo and pick up a win in my mind. And the issue, Chip, was never really a talent, and I'm going to use it as a way to transition into your Kendall Weaver point. It was kind of a weird cohesiveness / just cold stretch / are we going to put it all together kind of thing, because they had first half leads against Texas Tech, against UCF. It was a back and forth game against West Virginia. I was ended up pulling that one out. So, Chip, I know we're not going to get into this in our take it or leave it. Something I didn't have time to discuss with you before taping this, so I apologize ahead of time. But this is what I think is the crucial move for Rodney Terry. It was inserting IT Horton into the starting lineup, which served twofold of a purpose. One, it got IT, whatever you're going to get out of IT Horton, you have to have it, right? Him going 3 straight games without getting a bucket, that totally does not serve the purpose of being on this team. Defensively, you know what he is. Offensively, you have to hope you're getting at least between 7 and 12, 13 points per game out of him in some form or fashion. So getting him off of the second unit, somewhere that clearly he'd kind of hinted at he wasn't the most comfortable with. I know he hinted at that after the UT Arlington win, and in which he started for Tyrese Hunter and got the double-double, 10 points and 10 boards. So at least get him starting, right? And then what that allowed is for Chip's guy and Kendall Weaver to be the first guard off the bench. Because when IT was on the bench, it was IT coming off, and then it'd kind of be Kendall Weaver, who else kind of fits, right? So to your point about Kendall, that guy, as you talked about, consistent energy, consistent effort all the way through. To your point about him playing more minutes, Chip, I will say this. I don't necessarily know. I'll put it to you like this. I don't think you necessarily can be minutes per game from Kendall Weaver, right? Because seemingly he's shown with the more minutes he plays, his numbers kind of rise, and you get more of those, what I'm going to call Brock Cunningham kind of hustle plays, right? My concern is if he's at 20 minutes per game, is it, for lack of a better phrase, Chip, is he like a Brock guy where you're getting the most value from him in 15 to 16, 17 minutes? Because we've seen what Brock Cunningham's numbers from last 2 years to this year have shifted in him playing 26, 27 minutes per game. All of his numbers are down. I don't know, right? That to me is a hit or miss, especially this being his first year at this level. That's where I'm a little bit concerned, because it's not necessarily putting a bridle on his potential. We saw he was the WAC freshman of the year last year. He's certainly someone's got a high ceiling. But at this point in his career, is it too much to expect of him if he's getting 20 to 22 minutes per game? That I'm a little bit iffy on. But I just want to give credit to RT, because I think there were some people, Chip, who wanted a starting lineup of 8. Instead really worked well and served a twofold purpose in unlocking Kendall Weaver.
Well, the thing I like about Kendall Weaver and how I think he's different from Brock Cunningham is he's a 6'3" guard with the length of a 6'5" guard. So he gives you something unique on the perimeter, whereas Brock is a tweener. He's undersized. He's too big to guard the best, perimeter player on the opponent's team. He's always trying to, he he needs to be more like a PJ Tucker type, an undersized power forward. And if he can hit that three ball consistently, he did hit one against OU. Maybe he comes back. But for Kendall Weaver, he's the only one who gives you perimeter ball pressure, and your defense is set by your perimeter. If the guards can get into you, if they can get past your perimeter defense, you're screwed. Your big men don't know where to go because they're trying to guard their man, but then they have to help. And with Weaver, he was actually pushing, OU's guards out with his pressure defense. And I'm sitting there going, okay, we haven't seen this. Like, as much as I like Tyrese Hunter, and he was the Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year as a freshman at Iowa State, we haven't seen that kind of defensive intensity. But with Kendall Weaver on the floor, you do see it. All the players start to play with a little more defensive intensity. And I think that's the part about Kendall Weaver that is so tricky, because his stats don't say it. He's 5 of 20 from three. He was a 40% shooter from three a year ago. Look, he doesn't have it right now. So if he can stay efficient, last night it was attacking the basket with drives. He got some layups. He got fouled. He was 3 or 4 from the free throw line. Or he came flying in on a tip in of a Horton miss late in the first half. That was big because OU looked like they were about to stretch their lead out. And that play actually caused Fran Fraschilla to say, you can say Weaver has kept Texas in the game this half. And I just think what we've seen from him, and I know I'm going on and I'll let it go here in a minute, but what we've seen from him is the more minutes he gets, like he got 26 minutes against Marquette. He had 2 blocks. He has 8 blocks on the season, most of any guard by far. And only, he trails only, only the team's forwards, and same with his offensive rebounds. He's got 15 offensive rebounds, most of any guard, and, second only to the team's forwards. So he goes and he gets you extra possessions. And that's the part that, people, he can't score. It's 4 on 5 if he's out there. Well, if he would become a screener, like if Rodney Terry said, listen, you need to screen for Max Abmas, everything, become a better screener, maybe set up some give and go operations, because we know he can get to the rack, get fouled. I think there's ways you can use him, but I've made the comparison before to Royale Ivy, a young Royale Ivy. People hear Royale Ivy now and they're like, he was on the Final Four team. Don't compare him to Royale Ivy. If you've ever heard Rick Barnes tell the story, his first practice, he was so scared to shoot, he was turning it over. And Rick Barnes yelled at Rob Lanier and said, who recruited this guy? Okay, that's how the Royale Ivy era started at Texas. He ended it as one of the best defensive perimeter players in school history. And if you wear 24 at Texas, people are like, oh, wow. I wonder if, he's been anointed as the next Royale Ivy. I'm just saying this guy raises the level of play of his teammates, and makes up for mistakes with hustle. And I think this team needs that, and you've got Abmas, who's consistent, is unbelievable. Now number 15 all time on the scoring list. You've got Dizu, who, look, he's not going to play like he did last night every night, but he's capable. And then, now you've got Kendall Weaver. So I don't know. We'll see.
No, Chip, it's definitely a we'll see. I mean, the move, and to your point, I think a smart point on your part about Kendall's his length, right? Him being a bigger guard, that certainly helps, especially against these Big 12 guards. And listen, I got to give Max Abmas a lot of credit. I saw Fran Fraschilla send out a tweet earlier today talking about the fact that he was a little skeptical as to whether or not he'd be able to get his offense, his points off at this level. I was skeptical in terms of defense, right? And it's not to say that Max by any means is, an all Big 12 defender. However, he he's making bigger guards work for it, Chip. And that's the most you can ask for from a guy who is of his size. He's making them work for it. There was the play, against Texas Tech where Pop Isaacs, just took him right down there in the lane and they'll do what he want with him. But those plays have been few and far between on the defensive end. But to your point, as far as the perimeter defense with Kendall, yeah, he definitely provides that. Excuse me. Another thing I think with him, talking with him preseason, was he really wants to work on kind of his ball handling point guard skills. Because I think in that sense, Chip, it will give him more, an added dimension, more versatility as someone who's still kind of, when you talk about his scoring, finding himself as a finisher, still not a consistent finisher. He gets to the rack, but still isn't consistent as a finisher. Doesn't always get that call, which, sends him to the line or not. So definitely a lot of upside with Kendall. And again, with that move, as I talked about, it's really unlocked, kind of that latter half, because now we've seen, if you notice, Chris Johnson has appeared in ball games now as the next guard off the bench. So kind of those last two guys off the bench has kind of been, shifted between him and Zarek Onyema. We'll see. I'm sure that probably will depend based on the opponent as far as who will be that 8th, 9th, 10th guy off the bench. But hey, listen, that move has paid immediate and major dividends for Rodney Terry's club. And now if they can get this next one against BYU, you got to feel really good about Texas being back in the thick of things in a Big 12 that still a long ways to go. What we knew was that the 1-3 start, if they didn't pick up their play, it was going to be an issue. But the fact that they have picked up their play, now you got to feel good about them kind of getting themselves back in the race.
Yeah. Yeah. And your veteran guys are leading the way. Dizu, Asmus. All right. Texas women, big game actually tonight. Again, we're recording on Wednesday, taking on Oklahoma. And Madison Booker just continues to get more and more comfortable. The freshman point guard, scoring point guard, setting up teammates. It's been a phenomenal story. We will get into that more as we, follow them. But Vic Schaefer, that's a confident team. I look for Texas to handle business against the Oklahoma Sooners. All right, Eric, you ready for some love it or leave it? Or take it or leave it?
Love it or leave it, or take it or leave it, Chip. Whatever you got for me, I am absolutely ready, my man.
All right. Well, don't go anywhere, because coming right back, we will have take it or leave it. And if you're watching us on the Horns 24/7 YouTube channel, we will roll on. So, Eric, who's up first?
You've got take it or leave it. I am sending it to you, Chip. So
Okay.
I will start it off. Landing defensive tackle, Tia Savea. And I'm really glad that he goes by Tia, because I was still working on saying Tio. Is it Tio Ali? I've tried to look at the phonetic pronunciation.
Aoli.
Aoli. There we go. But Tia Savea is as important for the defense as landing the wide receiver trio of Matthew Golden, Isaiah Bond, and Silas Bolden. Chip, take it or leave it.
I'm gonna take this, actually, because the thing that stands out about Tia Savea is his run defense. So he's 6'4", 305 pounds. He played the nose tackle at Arizona, but his PFF run defense grade was higher than every other Texas defensive tackle outside of Tavondre Sweat and Byron Murphy. And we know that the number one priority, especially after having a season in which the Texas defense was number 3 in the nation in run defense, giving up only 84.2 yards per game on the ground, is stopping the run. We know that Tavondre Sweat was a beast in terms of stopping the run. These are the hardest guys to find. Talk about it all the time in recruiting, finding a difference-making defensive tackle. I think Tia Savea is going to help this team with Alfred Collins's pass rush ability, because he's He was the third best pass rusher on the team behind Murphy and Sweat. I think this was a really big pickup, Eric. How about you?
Chip, I am going to take it. And I was torn because of the way that, you'd phrase this question was the wide receiver trio. And you can see, look on the surface and you say, man, how can one defensive tackle, a guy who hasn't been a full-time starter in his career, be as important? But here's why. When I dove into the numbers and I wrote this for Horns 24/7 on the site, Chip, it's almost kind of common sense. Maybe we've taken Tavondre Sweat and Byron Murphy for granted. To expect Alfred Collins and Vernon Broughton, and I know we were super excited, myself, probably is the chief guy in this group, being super excited about the next man up, right? And those guys going to develop, whether it was going to be under Bo Davis, and now obviously it's not going to be under Bo Davis. And Chip, it's a lot to ask to be Byron Murphy and Tavondre Sweat to be as good as they were last year, right? The margin for error, I mean, it's a lot. So we're talking about Pro Football Focus's top rated defensive tackles, and they've been that way since like week 4, week 5 of the year. So in my mind, even if AC and Broughton can't be as good, which again, not being as good could be Big 12 second team, Big 12 honorable mention, a really good Big 12 defensive tackle. If they can't be as good, having someone to fill those gaps, especially to your point, you said a run stuffer, right? The two things that you knew you were not, or the one thing you knew you were not going to do against those two guys, huge in my mind. So I would say landing Tia Savea is as important. And I'll even go as far as to say, let's see if there's one more defensive tackle out there in the portal who can really help bridge those gaps. It's not even necessarily about what's behind them in Zach Swanson and Aaron Bryan and Sadira Mitchell and Jeray Bledsoe. It's just the fact is, listen, Tavondre Murphy and Byron, this is the second time I've done that. Tavondre Sweat and Byron Murphy were really, really good last year. And to expect anyone to play at that level for 14 games, 15 games, 16 games in the playoff era, it's a lot to ask.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I don't. Yeah. All right. Take it or leave it. Number 2. Your biggest concern as winter workouts start is identifying new leadership on both sides of the ball after the off-season departures, all the playmaking experience that just walked out the door. Take it or leave it.
Biggest concern, I'm going to leave it, Chip. I always kind of felt that the natural leadership would evolve. The reason for that is this. For as much, Chip, as we poked and prodded and asked last year about what was the difference, the first thing that Jordan Whittington at Big 12 Media Days said, to quote Jay Witt, he said, "We really rock with each other," meaning we like each other off the field. We've set a culture. We've set a standard. And yes, while a lot of those guys, the Jay Witts, the Christian Jones, and Xavier Worthies, JT Sanders, etc., Sweat, Murphy, Watts, Jalen out the door, I do firmly believe that the culture has been set. And whether that starts with Steve Sarkisian being the man to lay his own story out there on the line in those Culture Wednesdays and it trickle all the way down, I do believe that culture has been set. It's one thing in my mind, Chip, if it's a player who says, I'm going to use an example, right? I'm going to use a throwback example. Say if it's a 2000s Miami Ed Reed, right? We've all seen the Ed Reed speech where he said, "Y'all ask if I'm good. Nah, dog, I'm hurt." It's one thing if that's a player who's setting that, and that can slowly through attrition kind of make its way out the door. I think Sark has started that, and I do think that can trickle down. So yes, it's going to take time for those guys to develop, but I don't think they'll have an issue finding those leadership.
Yeah, I'm going to leave this as well because I do think there's excellent leaders who can make sure that culture gets carried on. My biggest concern right now is who's going to be the defensive line coach, because that position, I'll say it again, is as important as the defensive coordinator, because that is the guy who is setting the tone up front on defense, making sure that those defensive tackles are getting developed, that they're stopping the run. Um, Bo Davis pushed for Byron Murphy to be able to shoot gaps in Pete Kwiatkowski's system, and Bo got his way, and it paid off. Byron Murphy, um, you know, was getting into gaps and causing havoc, and uh, that's going to be that's a critical position, especially when it comes to what you said earlier about maybe bringing in another defensive tackle in the portal, whether it's um, in May or what, and holding on to the recruits you have. Obviously, Texas has already let DeAndre Robinson out of his letter of intent. I was really excited about DeAndre Robinson, and um, and now you've got Melvin Hills, who is coming in the summer. You've already got Alex January on campus, and from Duncanville. But this was a big recruiting class. There was a lot of defensive tackles. Dominic McKinley, who ended up at LSU. Jamari Caldwell, the Houston transfer, who ended up committing to Oregon. And I should say Dominic McKinley has committed to LSU. I haven't kept up to see if he's actually signed there yet or not. But it's signing day's coming up. So that would be my number one concern. All right, take it or leave it, number 3, Eric.
To bring us home, Chip, and for the effort of full disclosure, we did write these. You wrote these yesterday, so this question might have been a little bit different if it were after the game. But the last one, Chip, the only 2 players for Texas men's basketball who have earned guaranteed minutes so far are Max Asmus and Dylan Dessou. Take it or leave it.
Yeah, I'm going to leave this because I just spent half the show arguing for Kendall Weaver to get more minutes. So I would say Asmus, Dessou, and Kendall Weaver. I'm going to stand on that hill. So I'm leaving this. I think there are 3 players who need guaranteed minutes. How about you, Eric?
That's why I wanted to give you that out. I wanted to make sure it was known, right? Because I know you would have maybe amended that had we done this today. But I'm going to leave it only because yes, I do think Kendall Weaver has demonstrated that when he enters the game, good things tend to happen. I'm a Dylan Mitchell guy as well. I think D. Mitch as a rebounder has taken leaps and bounds as far as just being consistent on the boards. Still working his way through defense, still finding that consistent offensive game. I really wish that free throw line elbow side jumper that he kind of tends to take would be consistent. Still a lot of his offense is on, getting out there and breakaways and dunks and being the highlight reel that he is, right? But still
cleaning up messes.
They're cleaning up messes. But I do think just by his presence on the boards, I think he's earned guaranteed minutes. So those would be the 4 that I would put, Chips. I'm leaving that one.
Okay. All right. Well, we appreciate everybody tuning in to this episode of the Flagship Podcast. Make sure that if you would like and subscribe to the Horns 24/7 YouTube channel, feel free to give us a 5-star review wherever you listen to the Flagship Podcast. And for Eric Henry, I am Chip Brown. Until next time, we'll see you over at horns247.com. Stay safe and keep the faith.